a trusted voice of truth and light.
The narratives that mislead most of us aren't outright lies. They're the deliberate omission of facts that could give us a more complete picture.
And a rally point for those who've accepted the reality that they are not sheep.
The world needs your leadership, and the essence of leadership is using your influence wisely wherever you happen to be standing.
This is the Bryan Hyde Show.
Well, hello there, and once again, welcome to the show as we revel in wrong think. And I've got my favorite wrong thinker, Gary Welch, joining me today. Hello, Gary.
And you are my favorite wrong thinker, Brian. I actually, you're I guess you would be the leaders of the wrong thinking society.
You know, that's the beauty. Wrong think has no leader. you have, you got to chart your own course. That's what makes you a wrong thinker.
Yeah, you're absolutely right on that, because that is the whole philosophy of wrong thinking, is that you just think for yourself and who cares what everyone else thinks. Yeah,
I mean, not that, you're running roughshod over anybody, but man, Gary, I've spent the last 30 years paying pretty close attention to what's going on, as in, trying to be aware, trying to be to the point where I could at least discuss most current events intelligibly. And I have never seen such a concentrated effort to deceive and to keep people in the dark through manipulation of data, most often omitting, key facts to various stories, and sometimes just shading the facts to where, this is the conclusion you're supposed to come to, on the part of the media. It's astonishing.
I've often had conversations about the steady progression of what I call socialist thinking, which is, we just push it a little bit, then we push it a little bit higher, then we push it a little bit harder. And we are getting into that phase now where they've done the propaganda and the influence and everything, where they're feeling very comfortable about forcing the issue, whether that's through violence, intimidation, cancel culture, media, social pressures. They are really getting now to the point where we're not trying to persuade you into our thinking. You are now required to do our thinking, think the same way we do.
Oh, and it's getting intense. And so when we talk about, people come and let's revel in wrong think, it's not so much that we're just trying to be defiant for the sake of being defiant, but we have a commitment to reality. We have a commitment to truth that we're not going to have intimidated out of us. And, of course, that's a lot easier to do when you have camaraderie, when you can see other people are doing the same thing. Courage just needs an example, and other people will start to catch it as they see people stand up. So we invite you, come find courage, come find camaraderie with your fellow wrong thinkers, but just never doubt for a minute. There is a battle for your mind. It's as real as can be. And we're going to do what we can to give you, hopefully, good information, things to consider. But what you do with that information, that's on you. That said, where do we begin today, Gary? I know you are very good at keeping your finger on the pulse. You had mentioned a couple of Fox News polls that grabbed your attention. What were those polls about?
So the one that I think really that we should start with, because of the Andrew Brown shooting that just occurred and is on the news now, and we've seen the riots already start in behalf of that, is the media perception that they are trying to tell you was what's going on, and what Americans are polling at is totally different. So the media would have you think that everybody is really up against the cops, that they hate the police, that they see them as the murderers, that they're trying to portray them. And yet Fox News did a poll where it was a 2-to-1 ratio, 62% versus 33%, showed that most Americans, obviously a great majority of Americans, are opposed to reducing our police forces. And that just basically what that is saying is, hey, we don't have any problems with the police. We don't have any problems thinking that if everyone said, oh, our police are out there murdering everybody and they're just shooting everyone at will and whatnot, there would be a great call to reduce the police force. But the polls are not showing that. And yet when you look on the media side of things, what are they saying? Is that this is what the Americans want.
Yeah, it's to me, there is a middle ground here, but it's not rioting versus police can kill whoever they want with impunity. I see some concerns with how the police are being used by the system. I see the blurring between the line of a peace officer and a warrior cop who is out there, to essentially act like a troop in an occupying force. But I don't know how we correct the problems, and there are some legit problems where I think everything becomes a police matter. In other words, laws are passed that send the police into situations where they never should have been in the first place. It really didn't require police intervention. I'll give you an example of this. There was an arrest made in St. George last week, and it was a guy who was, I'm trying to remember what he was accused of doing. It was some kind of little petty thing, like he was throwing rocks or something. I can't remember. Anyway, it was a guy who was accused of some very, very minor offense, but someone expressed concern, well, he might be violent. They rolled the SWAT team. They sent the SWAT team in, and the justification is, well, this is safer for everybody. And I beg to differ. I think that it doesn't, in fact, make us safer. It actually kind of desensitizes us to government being overreactive. And I think that's a problem that really does need to be addressed. On the other hand, when people are behaving in a murderously aggressive fashion, and I don't remember the name of the girl in Ohio, the 13-year-old who was trying to stab another girl and was shot to death by a police officer who was right there trying to stop her. The presumption is, well, that was gratuitous, and the police never had they had no right to step in there and intervene. Somewhere between those two extremes, I think, is the happy ground where the police can actually protect and serve and keep the peace with the necessary force and tools to do so, but they don't become an occupying army. And, I really don't want to see them under federal control. That's my big concern, is all the protests that are erupting, I think, are setting the stage for the president, among others, to step in and say, well, what we need to do then is just take your local departments under our wing and make sure they're all being regulated by our federal regulators. And that sounds very dangerous to me.
And that would be required if we had an out-of-control police force. They could very much justify that, saying, well, look, obviously your cities and local institutions and your local governments are not able to police the police per se. And therefore, we have to come in so that we can police them and make sure that they are not executing citizens. And it's just the hyperbole of that statement and the hyperbole of that thought, and that, we have to assume that police officers are going around executing citizens for no good reasons other than race. And that's all there is to it, that they just walk around shooting black people because they like to and they want to. You're right. They're trying to set something up so that they're saying we need to control this. Whereas the reality is, there is some reformation of the police forces we need to do. But I think that reformation comes in what is your job and how are you doing things? What is your role in this? We have turned our police force into revenue collectors. It makes up a significant part of every city's budget of the revenues collected by police force. We have turned them into going after everybody for every situation. And then we have the situation where we have neighborhoods that are predominantly violent, so that the police go in there with an attitude of, I'm going to get shot today, and I'm got to do everything in my power not to make sure that happens.
Yeah, it's a tough job, and the vast majority of police, I believe, are out there for the right reasons. I see a lot of them leaving law enforcement, though, because they see their role is changing, or at least the way that they are being utilized to where they're becoming very well-trained and expensive babysitters for society, as opposed to actually going after criminals who've harmed another person or their property. Less laws would be a really good start. I mean, there's no act that a person can do that would harm another person that hasn't already been addressed in law. But for some reason, we have legislators that think, well, if one law is good, another one. The guy who engaged in a shooting, where was it, in Indiana? There's been a lot of talk about, red flag laws should have prevented him from doing that shooting, but they didn't. And yet nobody makes the connection that those gun control laws don't stop people intent on doing harm. But what's the remedy they suggest? Well, then we just need more of them. I don't know how you start to break through and make sense to people in that situation.
Well, when we come back from the break, let's talk about that. I want to talk about how police officers use these minimalist type of laws to catch criminals.
So you're gonna take the positive side of what would be called the like the broken windows theory that Rudy Giuliani used when I think they cracked down on jaywalking, spitting on the sidewalk to head off the bigger crimes. Okay, sounds like a good discussion. We'll be back right after this.
This is the Bryan Hyde Show. This is the Bryan Hyde Show.
All right, welcome back to the show. Gary Welch is my guest, and we are talking about one of the many issues going on now, but it's police reform. Gary, you said you could make a case that those little laws, those piddly little laws, sometimes, in fact, do help police solve crimes.
So I worked very closely with the police a long time ago, mostly on a volunteer level. But I got very involved with the things that they do. And one of the things that they told me was when it comes to chasing criminals or likely suspects, so they know someone's dealing drugs, but they've never been able to catch them at it, or they see them in the right place at the right time and things happen. So they go, okay, we think that, Joe Jones there, he is a possible drug dealer. But they don't have enough for a warrant. It's very difficult to get a warrant, or it's very time consuming to get a warrant to go after him. Or maybe they just are feeling about, they're very cautious because of lawsuits. Everybody's lawsuit crazy now. And if you arrest somebody and you don't have any evidence or anything like that, you get sued. So they're very conscious of that. So they actually like these little teeny tiny laws. You didn't turn your blinker on, you crossed the lane, you looked at the window funny, whatever it is, as long as it's legally on the books, they like those laws. And that's what you're actually seeing in all of these cases. The number one thing that you see over and over again is the individual got pulled over or was stopped for something little, jaywalking, running a red light, not turning on a signal. They like those things because that gives them then the excuse to pull you over, to start this, basically search you or, see what's going on. And then that can lead to, well, we found drugs on him and we found all those other things. They talk a lot about that they use that a lot of arrests. I'll give you one good example of what they told me about when I was working with them. And that was, they knew that there was a drug delivery in a car, that somebody had a whole bunch of drugs in their car and that they were going down the freeway, was being delivered from one place to another. But they didn't want to rat out their informant. The informant had told them, hey, this car just took off and it has a bunch of drugs in it. So what they did is they basically tailed the car and they waited for that individual to make a mistake. In this case, he made a lane change without turning on his signal. That gave them the excuse. Oh, we're going to pull him over. And what the whole story then was, well, we pulled him over because he made an illegal lane change and he didn't use his signal. And then once we had him pulled over, we alerted on the drugs and popped the trunk. And lo and behold, hey, we just caught our drug dealer. That's how they use those laws.
That sounds a lot like fishing season, being opened. And I don't have a problem with them catching people who are actually doing harm and taking them off the streets. If it makes the community safer, great. But I have a big problem with those so-called pretext stops. Well, your license plate light wasn't working or something like that, only because it's not a slam dunk. We're going to get something on this person. Or if they have that attitude, then they may be tempted to manufacture something in order to get something. To me, it takes them away from more tangible examples of people doing harm and unfortunately strains the innocent through the same net that they're using to try to catch the guilty. And I get not everybody's going to agree with that, and I don't expect them to. I would rather err on the side of caution of not letting police interfere in people's lives unless there's a very good reason to do so, like probable cause that they are involved in a crime, as opposed to, well, you didn't signal for 2 seconds and then move over. That, to me, just seems to invite interactions that are sometimes unnecessary and often dangerous for the officer.
And I would agree with you. I didn't bring it up as a justification of what they were doing, but simply telling you the tactics. Like, you will get resistance from police officers if you started a reform movement within the policing profession of saying, hey, let's get you out of revenue generation. Let's get you out of traffic control, that's really not your purpose, and put you more into a crime prevention role, which is really what you should be doing. You will get a lot of resistance of that because they like those little laws, like I said, to make it easy for them rather than do the necessary things of getting a warrant, finding evidence, and all those other things that they need to do. So there would be some resistance within the police community for trying to make those reforms, but they're absolutely necessary that we make those kinds of reforms. We've got to get them out of the babysitting. We're in your face all the time. Most people who interact with a police officer interact with them on a negative context. They're either giving us a ticket or pulling us over or something like that. That should not be the norm of how we interact with our police. It should be actually that 95% of us never interact with the police.
Here.
We just go through our lives without having nothing to do with them.
It's very telling. I have friends who are police officers who have told me when they're driving in someplace other than the jurisdiction where they work and a police officer pulls in behind them, they get nervous. I mean, the pucker factor begins for them because they don't know for sure who they're dealing with. And, it varies from agency to agency. Some agencies are told, you go out there and you find a reason to write those tickets. And I know they're not supposed to have quotas, but again, you talk to officers in certain departments and they'll tell you, yes, we were told you have to write this many tickets per day or you're going to be under scrutiny as to are you really doing your job, which means they had incentive to go look for reasons to hook people up. And I think that's destructive in the sense that if you have to look for a reason, that's going to break down the trust that you need to do your job within the community.
And police forces are government institutions. Never forget that, with a government mentality. So if you want to get promoted, if you want to have better pay, more pay, and things like that, what do you have to do? You have to grow. So the only way to grow is to create reasons for growth. And tickets are basically the fastest way to do that. Not only do you create growth by work, but you create growth by revenues. So we're generating so much revenues for the city. They say, okay, yeah, let's hire more people. Well, hire more people means we need more sergeants, more captains, more bosses, more supervisors. And that just creates the opportunity. All government agencies work under that principle. How can I grow my institution so that I can get a better job?
Well, and here's the flip side of the coin, too, with what we're facing now in America, and that is there is a segment of people who are acting as if, because I am a victim, your laws don't apply to me. And you see this often in some of the inner city communities where there's bad blood between them and the police. And, I'm not trying to comment on whether, the police deliberately go in there and abuse them. I think the police are seen as an occupying force or as an enemy and are treated as such. But when you have people who are behaving, and I'll just use again the example of this girl in Ohio. She's fighting with other young people. A police officer pulls up on the scene, and this girl just absolutely goes berserk with a kitchen knife, yelling, "I'm going to stab the effing you-know-what out of you," and proceeds to run at the girl and pin her against the car. What option does that leave the police officer but to intervene? And in this case, unfortunately, he was dealing with someone actively using a deadly weapon. I see that as a pretty clear-cut case of defending someone's life. Unfortunately, there are those who say, no. He was in the wrong because it was just a knife fight and, kids will be kids or some variant of that.
Yeah, and they're just trying to push this narrative that all cops are out there executing people, not defending themselves. That's not a good narrative to have. So you have to have the narrative is that really wasn't the case. They're just saying that so that they can execute this individual.
Yep. I'm glad that I get to pick your brain as far as getting the various angles of this, because right now it's such a highly politicized and emotional topic. I think it's really hard to have a good, productive discussion of this, at least in many corners. We've got to take a break. Gary Welch is my guest. We'll be back right after this.
This is the Bryan Hyde Show. This is the Bryan Hyde Show.
All right, welcome back to the show. Gary Welch is my guest. We have a lot of other interesting things to discuss. One thing I wanted to share with you, Gary, before we dive into this next topic, we have kept abreast of all the different COVID restrictions, the COVID policies, now vaccination. And I saw an article. This was from, let me see if I can get the person's name right here, Sinead Murphy. It's called The Capture of Goodness. And what it refers to is how goodness has been captured by the state and used as a tool to get people to do what the political class wants them to do. And here's the phrase that shows this. It's a statement that was issued by the leaders of 23 countries, including the UK, France, and Germany, on the matter of pandemic preparedness. This is the key phrase. Nobody is safe until everyone is safe. And the idea here is that, all the things we've done before, we kept our distance, we put on masks, we stayed away from each other, we didn't go to work, all of these things. Being good, to other people was one of the ways that these things were sold. Social distancing, wear your mask, that's the good thing to do. But now it's being extended to something where nobody is safe until we're all safe. And that good, I think, implies if you don't get the vaccination, well, you can't really be a good person. And if you're not safely vaccinated, then nobody is safe. That seems a little manipulative to me. Talk me off the cliff, if you would.
Well, why would we ever want the state to establish morality of what is good? That
good
state
point.
Definition of what is good, I don't think they should be the ones that are determining that, and then saying, well, you need to do what we tell you because we know what is good for you and what is good. In particular, I have a lot of problems with them just saying we know what's good for you, but I have even more problems in saying we know what is good and righteous from our point of view, because I've never seen anything in government where they followed principles of what I would classify as good morals.
Yeah, it just struck me as, we've wondered, when is this all going to lift? When are we going to finally resume some degree of normality? And I think that's part of the answer right there. If you've allowed government to determine what is normal and what isn't, guess what? It's never going to go back to at least what you remember as normal. It's going to be whatever those in power at the moment say is acceptable. And I watched a press conference earlier this morning, with Dr. Fauci, among others, from the CDC. And, the idea was, well, we have some great news, everyone. Now, if you're fully vaccinated, you can go without your mask outdoors. I'm like, and are there people who are actually waiting, like breathlessly holding their pearls? And, are they going to tell us we can? What's next? That we can celebrate the 4th of July with a hot dog? Because I seem to remember that being a promise here a few weeks ago.
Well, they've already established that, yes, they can. I mean, this whole issue of with the mask, especially as long as they protracted it out, they are now just basically piling on what they've established and getting us used to that. Okay, we will tell you now when it's okay for you to take off the mask. We will tell you when it's okay to get back together. We will tell you when it's okay to have your families together again. This whole thing that we control your lives, and that assumption on their part that they control our lives. I think the dangerous part about that is that assumption. They really believe that they have that power. Whether or not they really do, their assumption that they have, and they're going off that means we've never, disabused them of that and said, wait a second, no, you don't have that ability to tell us whether or not we can take off the mask. We have it. We're going to do it.
Yeah, it's something I would rather take control of myself. Now, you had also pointed out that there's some concern or some question over one of the vaccines, that there was a batch that was tainted. I wasn't aware of the backstory here, but tell me about somebody made a very timely sale of some stocks of that company before the news came out about the tainted batches.
So this actually has a lot of components to it, and it's a very fascinating look at the whole vaccination process in a COVID environment. Normally, when we're doing vaccines, there are these procedures and processes that they are worked with that are very established. They start very early with it and take it through. It's about a year-long process that they use. Now, supposedly, they were trying to get this faster, although I really look at it, I thought, you know what? For all the things that they did and all the exceptions that they made, I really don't see these vaccines coming out any faster than a normal flu vaccine would. If anything, it might even been later. But one of the things that happened was, in order to expedite these vaccinations, they outsourced a lot of it. So you heard of, Johnson & Johnson vaccine and the other vaccine. These companies didn't do it themselves. They actually hired a lot of other companies to assist them in making them. And so Johnson & Johnson hired a company called Emergent to help them with creating more vaccine and to get it out faster. Well, because of the processes, because of the procedures, these guys were hurrying. They were doing a lot of things. The FDA did come in. They did an inspection, and they looked at it and they go, nah, sorry, this stuff, you didn't do the proper procedures. You didn't keep it in the proper temperature. You got to get rid of it. Well, that equaled 15 million doses. That is a significant amount. But here was the funny part. So what happened was they came in, they've identified that there's an issue. They got problems with this. And the CEO of Emergent says, ooh, I better sell stock. This is a good time to sell stock. So he sells $10 million of stock when it's at its highest price, because everybody's looking at them and saying, oh, these guys are going to be putting out the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. That's going to be a very popular vaccine because it's a one shot instead of two shots. So their stock was running really, really high. After the news broke on this, it dropped down to the point that he probably would have only been able to sell for half the price that he did had they known it. So he knew this. When he sold his stock, he knew that this was coming, and he basically took advantage of it. And so now the socialists are basically taking this and saying, look, this is why we don't trust capitalism. This is why we don't trust corporations and CEOs. They're all greedy pigs, and they'll try to get as much out of us as they could. They'll lie, cheat, and steal. That's just all part of this propaganda. But where I'm going with this is, if we are free market people, if we are capitalists, how do we approach this? How do we respond to these socialists that are saying, oh, this is just another example of corporate greed and why we must control them with government?
Wow. So I'm curious your take on the vaccines. I know you're not against people getting the vaccine, but what is your take on the efforts to kind of ramp up compliance with it? I mean, this was one of the central messages of the press conference that Dr. Fauci and others held today. But it was along the lines of, look, if you're over 16, you really need to get this vaccine. And it's important you do this, I mean, come on, there's businesses out there that'll give you freebies if you can show them proof of your vaccine. Europe isn't going to let you travel there if you don't have the vaccine. What's your take on that, Gary? Are they pushing us pretty hard, or pushing us just right?
No, they're pushing us hard on that. And I am opposed to that government enforcement of vaccines. I'm a believer of vaccines in general, and that if the normal procedures and the proper procedures are put in place, that vaccines are safe. So I'm not one of those guys. I do take the attitude that most vaccines are safe. And both me and my family have always been ones for getting vaccinated for the flu bugs and things like that. Never had an issue with it. But in this scenario, I saw an agenda of using vaccines basically to justify the way of getting us back without getting us back and admitting that they're wrong. See, this vaccine whole issue comes in a way of we're seeing the COVID fatigue, we're seeing the resistance, we're seeing the breakdown of all these rules and regulations and restrictions we put on them. The vaccine comes in and saves the day. It says, well, everybody got vaccinated, so we can pull back now. And it gives them their excuse, and then they can do it again. Whereas if they come back and everybody just said, look, you're wrong, it didn't work, you didn't do anything, the vaccinations didn't do it, the herd immunity took over, which is always happens, then they're in trouble because they can't impose it again.
It's kind of fun to watch some of the government officials trying to save face. Now that it's becoming clear, the restrictions are lifting, the numbers are still dropping, the cases are falling, and it's they're trying to find a parade, basically jump in front of it and start marching. Oh yes, this is all for me. Why this is exactly what we were suggesting. And anyway, I'm a cynical guy, Gary, and I get more cynical the more I see politicians unable to say the words "I don't know" or "I was wrong" or heaven forbid "I'm sorry." Oh, well, I won't hold my breath. We've got one more segment to go with Gary Welch. We'll be back just the other side of these messages.
This is the Bryan Hyde Show. This is the Bryan Hyde Show.
And we are back. Gary Welch is my guest. And we're talking about some things that play well into the discussion of capitalism versus socialism. Gary, let's pursue it from there.
So, we talked about the actual incident, but this is part of a much larger picture that I think is really where I want to take the discussion. And that is, how do we react to these things? So these things happen all the time. We hear story after story after story about CEOs that are manipulating the system or doing things that they're not supposed to or taking advantage of others. And the socialists use that as an excuse for getting more government involved. But here's the problem. We always do this or polar opposite. We actually have to do and take the exact opposite and say, well, no, these CEOs are not greedy. Corporations are not bad, because we don't want them to have any kind of leg to stand on to push their agenda. And we know that's what they're doing. But the reality of it is, and this is what I'm asking, is should we be doing that? Should we have to take that polar opposite and say, no, this is, rare when we know it's not. This is unique. This has nothing to do with capitalism. I really think that that's hurting us as much as what the socialists are doing.
No, I would agree. Tell me this, as you look around and you see some of the different policies that are being implemented by the Biden administration. I mean, they've finished their first 100 days in office, and it sure seems like our economic ship is being steered right into the rocky shoals at full speed. It seems deliberate. I can't imagine that. I don't know how anybody could conclude that this is not going to put some serious oppressive weight on the economy, and raise energy prices like we've already seen.
And this is, I think, what they're trying to do. They when you have an attitude that you can control the weather, you can control the climate, that you can control a virus, what's controlling the economy to you? Of course you feel like you can do that. We can control everything. I mean, I've talked about this before, that they are taking on godlike attributes and personalities, and that, we can manipulate everything and we can make it happen and we can control everything, that everything should be under our control. And as we have seen in all of those cases, they really messed it up. and they're doing it this time. And this is kind of where I'm getting to my point. I have always argued that large corporations want a socialist society just as much as a large government does. They're in cahoots with these folks. This, for them, it is not a situation where we are thinking that these guys are free market and they're capitalists just like we are. They are absolutely not. Your average small business, yes, I would absolutely put them into the capitalist free market mentality. But for these large corporations, they benefit much, much more under a socialist large government agenda and a controlled economy that is being controlled by them and their government cronies versus a true, what I would call a true capitalist system where we're just letting the free market run it.
You know, I'm curious what you think about the recourse that the people have, because right now I don't have a lot of faith in elections, and that's at the federal level as well as at the state level. It seems like the system is pretty prone to manipulation. Having said that, I understand that there have been enough signatures collected in California to possibly recall Governor Gavin Newsom. What are your thoughts on that one?
That is an example of that the tyrannical approach does have consequences. I wish it was all over the place. New York does not have a recall process, and that absolutely astounds me. So somebody like Governor Cuomo, that we can really attribute thousands of lives that were lost. It's directly to him and his decision to put COVID patients in these homes, these senior homes and assisted care centers, that thousands of people have died, and yet there is no recall process for that. Whereas in California, we do have that process, and they've gotten enough signatures now to make it happen. They're trying to correct a wrong, and it bothers me that, like, why isn't this all over the place? Every government institution should have a correction process within it so that we can make changes midstream. If somebody's in the middle of their term, it doesn't matter. If they mess up, we should have a people recall, not a government recall scenario where we can remove them.
Yeah, it'll be curious to see how the media treats this, and in fact, how the political class responds to it as well. I'm not sure. I'd love to see Gavin Newsom. I'd love to see him removed from office just for the hypocrisy of his lockdown policies. And, while he's, at the, I forget what it was, the French Laundry or whatever, dining with his friends. But I want to see people start pushing back. I think the time has come where we need people to stand up and this, I support that peaceful way of removing him from office. But I'm looking at what's happening in a lot of different countries. Germany, for instance, just saw some video today of a German guy standing in the town square, people standing around, all socially distanced, as he's reading from the German Constitution. And it's a pretty terrifying thing. He has to read loud. So, I mean, it's like, really loud, guttural German. But he finishes reading, goes to hop on his bike, and 4 fully armored up riot cops tackle him to the ground and arrest him. One person stepped up for a moment and said, hey, and they, immediately sent cops over there to stop him. But there was people standing around clapping. If more of them had simply swarmed over there and peacefully, piled on, I think they could have avoided the situation. But I don't know. It's very discouraging to see. The lockdowns are continuing and intensifying in some places. I'm not sure we're out of the woods yet. I mean, what's your gut feeling on this?
I do feel, and this is again going back to wrong think, there is a submission culture that is really strong. It's very, very strong in Europe. They have pretty much adopted that as a culture, that you do submit to authority all the time, every time. And I'm starting to see it here in America, that we're accepting this submission culture. Now, I've always agreed that in humans, as humans, just as human behavior, that we always are trying to get along, that there's not a lot of us that stand up and stick our heads up and scream and shout and yell and fight back. That just really is not the majority. It's a very small minority that does that. But I do believe there is a difference between that and submission. And then as an Americans, generally as a society and as a culture, we have not been a submissive bunch. Our country was founded on non-submission, that we just didn't say, well, go ahead, roll over us. We're okay with that. We have always been that, what they call the rugged individualist. But I am starting to see that now. We're starting to look at, well, if they say it's okay, I guess we should do it.
I'm also starting to see a very clear exodus from some of the states that took the more hardcore approach, and people fleeing to freer climates. And, part of this is I've recently been looking at the real estate situation here in our home state of Utah. I've been in Idaho recently looking at the real estate situation there. There's a lot of people coming out of California and Washington and other states that really have strict lockdown policies. Oregon, for example, wanting to make them permanent. And they're voting with their feet, which, creates a solution on the one hand. It creates some complications on the other hand. But I'm happy to see that there are people exercising that volition rather than just sticking around and submitting and, well, I guess I'll vote smarter next time. They're like, no, screw that. I'm out of here. It's time to go and start a life somewhere where I'm not feeling that hot breath of the state down the back of my neck at every moment.
And that is, I guess that it's a passive way of dealing with it. I saw the same reports. There's been reports, and they divide it into blue states, red states, and that blue states are losing people rapidly and red states are gaining people rapidly. But I actually look at it as more from a strong government control versus a less government control option, that's where people are moving to. But again, I would prefer you change the state you're in versus leave it, because all you're doing is just leaving a core behind of people you don't want there.
That'd be a good topic for another day, because I'm not above voting with my feet, but no matter where I am, if circumstances don't permit it, I'm going to do my best to try to influence things in the direction of freedom. Gary Welch, thank you so much for being my guest today.
Thanks, Brian.
This is the Bryan Hyde Show.